The Omega smiled and waited for a bond that was not coming. Itsuki Mori stood in his own living room and watched the man he had paid for fail to fall in love on schedule. The paperwork called it activation. The brochure had called it the imprint. The Omega was supposed to look at his buyer and feel it take, and then the bonding would follow within the hour, because the body would demand it. They had delivered him that morning and gone, and left a thin guide to the first week on the counter, and now there was only the two of them, and the quiet, and the thing that was supposed to happen. The Omega looked at Itsuki. Nothing took. His name was Akira. That was the only name he had. The folder had come with a serial number on the tab, and no surname anywhere in it, and Itsuki had not asked why, because asking would have meant admitting he meant to keep him. He was noticing the scent change. The Omega smelled of cold water and wet stone, clean and careful, exactly as the brochure had promised. But under it something was going wrong. The clean note was souring. A sharper smell was coming up through it, like a struck match. He had spent his whole life around scent, and he had never smelled anything do that. "How do you feel?" Itsuki asked. Akira did not answer right away. He was watching Itsuki with a steadiness that gave nothing away. "I feel it," he said. His voice was low and flat. There was no feeling in it at all, nothing that matched the words. The guide on the counter said the imprint presented within the hour, that it deepened over the first day, that the recognition was established, and that was the part that mattered. The Omega had said the words the guide promised he would say. Itsuki did not believe them. There was no recognition in that face. There was a decision being made behind it, fast and private, and he could not read what it was. He should have called the number on the card. He should have said the unit was defective and to come take it back. There was a return clause. He had read it twice. Instead, he let the lie stand, and he could not have said why, and the man he had purchased watched him let it stand and understood, in that first hour, that he had been kept. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's story. To understand how Itsuki Mori ended up in his own living room at noon on a Tuesday, unable to look at the most beautiful thing he had ever bought, you have to go back 2 years, to the worst night of his life, and then forward through all the smaller deaths that followed it. He had not always been the kind of man who buys people. He wanted that on the record, even if the only person keeping records was himself. He had inherited the company at 30 from a father who built it out of a couple of refrigerated trucks and a contract with a fish market, and he had been good at it, better than his father, in the ways that could be measured, and worse, in the ways that could not. Mori Logistics moved cold things across the country. Tuna, at the temperature that kept it worth a fortune. Vaccines that turned to garbage if they warmed even slightly. Itsuki understood the cold chain the way some men understand music, as a system of small mercilessnesses, 1,000 points at which a thing could spoil if you looked away, and he never looked away, and the company tripled in size under his hands, and the staff respected him and feared him in roughly equal measure, and not one of them knew his first name was something his mother used to call softly through a closed door when he was small and sad. He had been bonded once. Her name does not matter to this story except that it mattered to him more than anything before or since, and that she died on a wet road outside the city because a truck he had dispatched, on a route he had approved, in weather he had judged drivable, did not stop in time. He had signed the route. That was the fact he could not put down. Other men in his position learned to call it an accident and meant it. Itsuki had run the cold chain too long. He knew there were no accidents, only points where you looked away. The bond did not break clean when she died. It tore. For months afterward, he could not smell anything at all. His own scent gone flat. The whole world he had navigated by scent simply gone. Other people described grief as a weight. For him, it was an absence. A sense had died, and he walked around without it. His family did what families do. They circled. There was a company to think of, a succession, a bloodline that his father had bled to establish, and that his uncles spoke of as if it were a temperature that must not be allowed to drift. An alpha of his standing did not stay unbonded. It was bad for the firm, bad for the family, bad in some cosmic ledger that Itsuki's uncle kept in his head and consulted often. And love, real love, the kind Itsuki had had and lost, was a risk. It could be taken from you on a wet road. It could not be controlled. What the family wanted was the warmth without the exposure, the bond without the bottomless danger of choosing someone who could choose to leave, or worse, be taken. So when his uncle slid the cream-colored brochure across the dinner table, Itsuki did not throw it back. That was the thing he could not forgive himself for, later. He did not throw it back. He was so tired of the deadness, and the gray, and the company meetings where he made the cold chain perfect and went home to nothing, and the brochure promised a thing that could not be taken from him because it had been made to want only him, and in the most cowardly part of himself, that sounded like rest. The brochure was cream-colored and discreet, printed by a company that called itself by a name that meant nothing, the kind of name a holding company has. "We do not make companions," it said, on the first page, under no logo. "Anyone can buy a companion. We make compatibility. The omegas are engineered to a single buyer's scent genetic profile. The result is not a person who has been told to love you. It is a person whose biology recognizes you the way fated mates recognize each other, except that nothing is left to chance. Chance is cruel," the brochure said. "We have removed the cruelty. They imprint," the next page said, "completely. The most reliable bond science can produce, taken without exception in every unit delivered. You will never wonder whether he stays out of obligation, or fear, or habit. He will be incapable of wanting anyone but you. Some buyers find that troubling at first. They get over it." Itsuki had read it twice, in the gray of his empty apartment, and there had been a place at the end where a buyer could write a question and have it answered before he signed, and he had written the only question that mattered to him, the one he was ashamed of, even as his pen formed it. Could a person like that ever leave? The answer had come back in the same cream-colored typeface, and it was 3 words long, and he had understood that it was meant to reassure him. No, that is the entire point. And Itsuki Mori, who had loved someone free and lost her, had signed the papers because he could not survive losing again, and because a thing that could not leave could not be taken. And he told himself this was not the same as buying a person, and he knew, even then, that it was exactly the same. That was 4 months ago. The engineering took time, and now it was a Tuesday at noon, and the unit that could not leave had just lied to stay, which meant that somewhere in the careful machinery of the most reliable bond science could produce, something had come loose, and it was standing in Itsuki's living room, watching him with eyes that gave away nothing at all. "You lied to her," Itsuki said. "Yes. Why?" Akira considered the question with that unnerving stillness. He was dressed in clothes the clinic had provided, soft and neutral and slightly too perfect. A man dressed by people who had never asked him what he liked. He was beautiful in the specific way the brochure had promised, which was to say, beautiful in a way calibrated to Itsuki's own profile, and knowing that should have ruined it and somehow did not. "Because if I told her the truth," Akira said, "she would take me back, and the ones who go back don't come out again." "How do you know that?" "I don't know it. I feel it." He paused, and something flickered across the trained calm, gone too fast to name. "I'm not supposed to be able to tell the difference between what I know and what I feel. That is also a thing that's wrong with me." Itsuki stood very still. The souring water scent had stabilized slightly, the struck match note banking down to an ember, and under it, faint, almost not there, was something he had not smelled before and could not place. Scorched sugar, a thread of iron, like blood, or hot metal. "What is supposed to happen," Itsuki said slowly, "is that you look at me and you can't help loving me. That is what I paid for. That is what she guaranteed. I know. And it isn't happening." "No," Akira said. "It isn't." He said it without apology and without fear, which no companion-trained Omega should have been able to do, and something in Itsuki shifted, because the truth he had not admitted to his uncle or to himself, was that he had not wanted to be loved helplessly. He had told himself he did. But standing here, looking at a man who was looking back at him with a refusal in his face, Itsuki felt something he had not felt since before the wet road, and it took him a moment to recognize it because it had been gone so long. It was interest. It was the live, electric attention of a man who has just met someone he cannot predict. He turned away from it. He was good at turning away from things. "You will stay in the second bedroom," he said. "I'll deal with the clinic. I have a company to run." He went to work. He always went to work. It was the one cold chain he never let drift, but the office did not hold him like it usually did. He sat in the glass room above the warehouse floor and watched the forklifts move pallets of frozen things through the cold, and he ran the numbers on the eastern routes, and he approved a contract and declined another, and the entire time he kept circling back to the smell of the struck match, and the scorched sugar under it, and the impossible fact of a manufactured man saying no. He came home late on purpose. He told himself it was the contract. The apartment was dark. He had half expected to find Akira exactly where he had left him, parked in the middle of the floor like a delivery, because that was what the brochure implied you got, a thing that waited. Instead, the second bedroom door was open, and the light inside was on, and Akira was sitting on the floor by the window with the city spread out below him, and he was not doing anything. He was looking. He turned when Itsuki appeared in the doorway, and there was something in his face that the calm had not quite covered, and Itsuki realized with a small shock that it was wonder. "I've never seen it from up high," Akira said. "The city. Any of it. I've never been outside. The lights move." He said it like a man stating a discovery, with a kind of careful astonishment, reporting a fact he was not sure would be believed. "They go in lines and then they stop and then they go. I've been watching them stop and go for a long time. It was the trains." Itsuki knew it was the trains. The long, bright lines of them moving through the dark, stopping at stations, moving on. The most ordinary thing in the world, and he had stopped seeing it decades ago. He stood in the doorway and watched a made man watch the trains, and for the first time in 2 years, the deadness in him eased by some small amount. "Are you hungry?" Itsuki asked, because it was the only thing he could think of that a person was supposed to say. Akira turned the question over. "I don't know," he said. "I haven't been hungry yet. They fed me on a schedule. I never had to find out if I was hungry, so I don't know what it feels like when I am." Itsuki went to the kitchen. He was not a man who cooked. The kitchen was beautiful and barely used, chosen by a designer, like everything else. He found rice and eggs and the small mercy of being able to make one thing well, because his mother had taught him before the company swallowed his life, and he made it, and he set a bowl in front of the made man and watched him look at it. "You put it in front of me," Akira said. "Eat it if you want it. I'm trying to tell if I want it or if I'm supposed to want it because you made it." He looked up, and the trained calm was gone now, replaced by a frank and almost desperate honesty that Itsuki found he could not look away from. "That's the thing that's wrong with me. I can't tell which feelings are mine. They built me to feel things toward you. So when I feel something, I don't know if it's me feeling it or the building." Itsuki sat down across from him. The steam came up off the rice between them, and where it met the cooling night air and the two of them leaned in over it, a third smell rose, sharp and clean. The smell of something hot striking something cold, a smell that was not water and was not engine oil and existed only in the place where his scent and the made man's scent collided and vanished the moment Itsuki sat back. He had smelled it for an instant and he wanted, with an intensity that frightened him, to smell it again. "Try the rice," Itsuki said, to have something to say. "If you don't like it, that's information. That is yours, whether they built it or not." Akira picked up the spoon. He ate a careful bite. Something moved across his face. "It's too hot," he said, and then, wondering, "I didn't know I would mind. I minded. That was mine." And he smiled, small and astonished, at the discovery that he could dislike something, and Itsuki Mori sat in his designer kitchen at midnight and understood that he was in a great deal of trouble. He found it in the guide the next morning, in the part at the back that the front of the brochure had not advertised. Akira was at the window again, watching the morning trains with the same total attention, a cup of tea cooling in his hands that he had made himself because Itsuki had shown him the kettle and he had wanted to find out if he liked doing it. Itsuki sat at the counter with the thin booklet and read the section that began with a heading about stability, set in smaller type than the rest. The imprint is most stable once the bond is sealed, it said. An imprinted unit left unbonded too long may become unsettled. It is in the unit's interest to complete the bond promptly. And then, further down, in a sentence the writers had clearly labored to make sound like care, a line that told him everything by trying not to. Units that do not settle do not last. He read it 3 times. There was no number attached to it, no window given, nothing he could plan around, only the flat institutional certainty that a thing left undone would end, and underneath it, the instruction to do the thing, for the unit's own sake, before it was too late. The units that do not settle do not last. He set the booklet down. He looked at Akira at the window, at the careful, astonished attention he gave the most ordinary things, at a man who had never eaten rice until the night before, and had discovered that he could mind the temperature of it, and he thought about a route he had signed, and a road he had judged drivable, and he understood that he was being told, in the smooth, folded language of people who sell things, that the man at his window was dying, and that the cure was the one thing the man at his window had refused. He did not bond him. He could not have said why, only that it had something to do with the lie Akira had told to stay, and the rice he had minded, and the smell that existed only in the collision and could not be manufactured because it required both of them to be real. Days passed. Itsuki told the clinic he needed time. He told his uncle nothing. He went to work and came home earlier each evening, and he stopped telling himself it was the contract. He taught Akira the apartment first, because the apartment was safe and finite and could be learned. The kettle, the window that opened and the one that did not, the shower, which Akira stood under until the water ran cold the first night, and emerged from with his eyes wide, reporting that he had not known water could be warm on purpose, that at the clinic it had only ever been one temperature, and that he had decided he liked it very much, and that this also was his. He was almost sure of it. Then Itsuki taught him the building, the elevator, the lobby, the man at the desk who said good evening. The days took on a shape neither of them named. Itsuki went to the warehouse in the mornings and came home to find the apartment changed in small ways, a chair moved into the light, a cup left on the sill where the trains were best, the evidence of a person learning what he liked by doing it. He had lived alone in those rooms for 2 years, and they had stayed exactly as the designer left them, beautiful and unused, and now there was a man inside them touching things to find out how they felt, and the rooms had started to feel lived in, which was a thing Itsuki had not known he missed until it was happening to him. Akira learned him as he had learned the kettle, by watching and testing. He learned that Itsuki took his coffee black and standing up and never finished it. He learned that the hard set of the jaw when Itsuki came through the door was not anger, but the warehouse still running behind his eyes, and that it loosened if you put a warm cup in his hand and said nothing for a while. He learned that Itsuki answered direct questions and deflected soft ones, so he asked direct ones. Why do you work so late? Because the cold does not keep office hours. Why did you stop cooking? Because there was no one to cook for. Why is there no one? And Itsuki, who deflected soft questions, found that this one had been asked too directly to slide past, and he answered it, a little at a time, across several evenings, the wet road and the torn bond and the gray years, and Akira listened with the total attention he gave the trains, and did not offer comfort, because he had not been built with comfort and had not yet decided to learn it, and somehow the plain, unsoftened listening was better than comfort would have been. One evening Itsuki was reaching past him for the kettle, and Akira did not step back, and for a moment they were close enough that the cold water scent and the struck match note rose together, and the third smell flared between them, the hot pan and the cold water, and Itsuki stopped with his hand on the kettle and did not move, and neither did Akira, and the smell held in the small space between them longer than it ever had, because for once, neither of them had stepped back to make it stop. Then the kettle clicked and the moment broke, and Itsuki poured the water, and his hand was not quite steady, and Akira watched the unsteady hand with open interest, filing it away. A new thing learned about the man who had bought him, and was turning out not to own him at all. He did not say anything about it. But that night he moved the cup on the sill a few inches closer to the chair where Itsuki sat, so that the next evening, without planning to, they ended up in the train's light at the same time, not touching, watching the lines stop and go, and that became a thing they did, an unnamed appointment with the window that neither of them ever proposed and both of them kept. Then, because Akira had spent a week with his hand pressed to the glass, watching the bright lines move and halt and move again, Itsuki took him outside. The street undid him. Itsuki watched it happen. The maid man stood on the ordinary pavement of an ordinary Tokyo evening, with the konbini glowing on the corner and the trains overhead, and the river smell and the press of strangers who did not know that the person beside them had been grown in a tower for a buyer, and Akira's careful calm came apart entirely, not into panic but into something Itsuki could only call hunger, the first hunger he had named, a starving need to take in a world he had been kept from his whole short life. "There's so much of it," Akira said. He had stopped walking. People flowed around them. Everyone has a whole life. They are all just walking around with whole lives, and nobody is watching them do it. He turned to Itsuki, and the wonder in his face was almost unbearable. "Do you have one? A whole life?" "I have a company," Itsuki said. "That isn't the same thing." It landed harder than the maid man could have known. Itsuki stood on the pavement with the trains going over and felt how accurate it was, and he did not answer, and Akira watched him not answer with an attention that saw too much, and the souring water smell shifted and warmed at the edges, and the scorched sugar note rose under it, and for a breath, before the crowd jostled them apart, the collision smell flared between them on the open street, sharp and clean and gone. They walked. Itsuki bought him things from the konbini to find out what he liked, which became a game neither of them named, a small bright cruelty of a game, because every preference Akira discovered was a fresh argument that he was a person and not a product, and every one of them was also a thing that the clinic said would kill him if he was not bonded soon. He liked the egg sandwich and not the tuna. He liked the cold canned coffee and hated the hot. He hated a particular brand of gum so much that he made a face Itsuki had not seen before, scandalized and delighted at once. And Itsuki laughed, an actual laugh, the first in 2 years, and the sound startled them both. It became the best part of his day, a fact that crept up on him slowly and then arrived all at once. He stopped scheduling evening calls. He left the warehouse while it was still light. The eastern routes ran fine without him standing over them, which after years of never looking away was its own small revelation, that the cold chain held even when he went home to someone. He did not examine why he was going home. He told himself it was responsibility, the duty of a man to a thing he had bought and now had to keep alive, and the lie lasted about as long as the lie he had let stand in the first hour, which was to say, it lasted until the next time Akira did something that was only his. They fell into the habit of the window at night. Akira would make tea he did not finish, and Itsuki would not finish his coffee, and they would sit in the dark with the trains going over, and Akira would report on the world he was assembling, piece by piece, and the reporting got less flat as the weeks went, warmth bleeding into the even voice as the scorched sugar bled up through the engineered scent, the real thing surfacing through the made one. He said that he had decided rain was better than he had expected, and crowds were worse. He said he thought he understood now why people kept photographs, though he had none, and did not know what he would photograph if he could. He said, once, not looking over, that he had started being afraid of going to sleep, because sleep was the closest thing to the smoothing over, and he did not want to lose a single hour of minding things while he still had them. And Itsuki, in the dark, reached over without deciding to, and put his hand over Akira's where it rested on the sill, and Akira went very still, and then turned his hand over so their palms met, and neither of them said anything, and the trains went over, and the third smell rose and stayed, because neither of them moved away from it. After that, the distance between them stopped being a thing they maintained. Akira leaned into his shoulder at the window, and Itsuki let him, and then wanted him to. Itsuki learned the warmth of a body against his side again, after 2 years of an apartment that held no one, and the relearning frightened him, because it meant he had something to lose, and he found that for the first time since the wet road he was willing to be frightened, that the fear was the proof he was alive, in a way the deadness never had been. One night Akira fell asleep against him at the window, mid-sentence, the thing he was most afraid of taking him gently, while he was leaning on the man he had not been able to help leaning on, and Itsuki sat without moving for a long time so as not to wake him, his arm gone numb, and his coffee cold, and an ache under his ribs that he no longer had any way to call duty, watching the trains stop and go over the sleeping head of a man who had been made to love him and had refused, and who was, against all of it, learning to anyway, the slow, real way, by choosing to lean. That was the night he stopped lying about it. He did not love Akira because he had bought him, or because he owed him, or because guilt had dressed itself up as care. He loved the man who hated the gum and minded the rice, and was afraid of sleep, and turned his hand over in the dark. He loved the part of him the clinic called a defect, and he understood, with the cold clarity he brought to a failing route, that loving exactly that part was the one thing that made saving it possible, because you cannot fight to keep a thing you were only ever willing to own. It was on the walk home that Akira stopped under the lights of the station and said, without preamble, in the even trained voice that he used when he was saying something true and was afraid of it, "I can feel it getting worse." Feel what getting worse? The thing that's wrong with me. The not settling. They built me to point at you, and I won't point, and the part of me that was supposed to point is, I think, coming apart. He said it calmly, reporting a fact, the same as he reported the trains. It doesn't hurt yet, but I can feel the edges of it, like a sound you can't hear, but your teeth know is there. Itsuki's mouth was dry. There's a way to stop it. I know what the way is. Akira looked up at him under the station lights, and for the first time, there was something fierce in the maid face, a refusal that had nothing trained about it. If you seal the bond, the wrongness stops. But the part of me that minds the rice, and likes the warm water, and hates the gum, and wonders if I have a whole life, that part goes quiet. It settles. It smooths over. I have figured out what settled means. It means the me that is arguing with what they built gets folded back under, and the thing they built comes up on top, and it stays up, and it's happy, and it isn't me. He drew a breath. I would rather come apart as myself than be well as the thing they made. The trains went over. The crowd flowed. Itsuki Mori stood under the station lights with the smell of scorched sugar and iron rising off the only interesting person he had met in 2 years. A person he had bought precisely so that he would never have to feel this. The live terror of caring about someone who could be lost. And he understood that he had failed completely. That the thing he had paid a fortune to make impossible had happened anyway. On a pavement, over an egg sandwich, in the gaze of a man who would rather die than be the gift Itsuki had purchased. Then we find another way, Itsuki said. There's no other way. She would have told you if there was. She sells things. She tells you what makes you buy. I move cargo across a country at the exact right temperature, and I'll tell you what I've learned doing it. Itsuki heard his own voice go hard and certain. The voice he used on the warehouse floor. The voice that had never once before tried to save a person instead of a shipment. Every system has a point where it can spoil. And every system has a point where it can be made to do the thing it wasn't designed to do. I haven't found yours yet, but I haven't looked, and I'm very good at looking. Akira stared at him. The fierce thing in his face cracked, and under it, for just a moment, Itsuki saw something raw and young and entirely unmanufactured, a person who had never once been told that someone would try. Why? Akira said. It was barely a word. You could send me back. You could get a working one. That is what you paid for. The trains went over. Itsuki thought about the cream-colored brochure and the question he had written on it in the gray of his empty apartment. Could a person like that ever leave? No. That is the entire point. He thought about how badly he had wanted the answer to be no, and how the whole shape of his cowardice was contained in that wanting, and how the man in front of him was the first thing in 2 years that had made him ashamed of it in a way that felt like being alive instead of being buried. Because you can leave, Itsuki said. That's the entire point. He did not fully understand it himself yet, but Akira did. Itsuki watched the words land, watched the made man understand that he had just been handed the one thing the clinic had sworn he could never have, which was a door, and a person standing beside it who was not going to lock it. The smell between them changed. Not the collision note this time. Something slower. The souring water steadied. The struck match banked. And the scorched sugar, the wild, undesigned thing that had been bleeding up through the engineering all week, rose and held, and Itsuki breathed it in, and could not tell anymore where the manufactured scent ended and the real one began, and decided, standing under the trains, that he no longer cared to. Itsuki's phone buzzed in his pocket. He did not look at it. It buzzed again. The third time he looked. It was a message from a number he did not have saved, sent through the channel the paperwork had said was only ever used for matters concerning the unit. It was 4 words long. We are sending someone. Itsuki Mori had read enough contracts to know that the most dangerous sentences are the short ones. We are sending someone. No name, no time, no reason given, because reasons are for people you intend to negotiate with, and the clinic did not intend to negotiate. They intended to collect. He showed Akira the message because he had decided, somewhere on the walk home, that he was done being a man who let people learn the truth too late. Akira read it twice. He did not panic. The made calm settled back over his face, but it was different now. Itsuki could see the difference, because there was a person underneath it, choosing to be calm instead of a product built to be. They will say I'm defective, Akira said. That's the word they use when a unit does something they didn't design. Defective. It is easier than the other word. What is the other word? Alive. He set the phone down. If I'm defective, they can recall me, study me, find out what went wrong, and make sure the next ones can't do it. If I'm alive, they have to admit they have been making people and selling them, and that one of the people they made would rather die than belong to the man who paid for him. They will never say that word, so they will say defective, and they will send someone, and the someone will be very polite. Itsuki had spent his whole life keeping cold things from spoiling across great distances, and he understood, listening, that this was the same problem in a different shape. There was a thing that would break if he looked away. He was not going to look away. He did not take Akira to a cabin or a hotel or anywhere a frightened man would think to run, because running was a pattern, and patterns could be predicted. He took him to the one place the clinic would never think to look, which was deeper into Itsuki's own life. He took him to the warehouse. The cold storage facility ran all night because cold does not keep office hours. Itsuki had a glass office above the floor, and below it the great refrigerated halls where pallets moved through the dark at temperatures that would kill a man slowly. And around it, the whole apparatus of a business that the clinic's records would show belonged to a grieving alpha who did exactly what grieving alphas of his standing were supposed to do. They would search the apartment. They would not search the loading dock. Akira had never been cold before. Itsuki realized it the moment they stepped onto the floor, and the made man's breath came out white, and he flinched all over, not from fear, but from a sensation he had no file for, and he looked at the cloud of his own breath with the same astonishment he had given the trains. It comes out of me, Akira said. The cold makes me visible. It's just your breath. I know what it is. I'm telling you what it's like. He breathed out again and watched the white of it show and disappear. At the clinic, the temperature never changed. They kept everything the same, so we would stay the same. I didn't know a body could tell you the air had changed. I didn't know I would have weather inside me. Itsuki gave him his coat. It was too big. Akira disappeared into it and stood in the cold, breathing clouds, and Itsuki watched a man he had purchased learn that he had an inside that answered the outside, and felt the deadness in him finish lifting, scent flooding back, every smell of the cold floor sharp and present, diesel and frost and cardboard, and through all of it the scorched sugar that was Akira becoming real faster than the engineering could keep up. They stayed in the glass office. Itsuki ran the company by phone and email like nothing were wrong, because the surest way to make the clinic believe nothing was wrong was to keep the cold chain perfect, and he did, and the eastern routes ran on time, and a man dying of his own refusal slept on a cot in the office above the floor under a logistics company coat. It was the second night in the cold office when the fever came. Itsuki had read the brochure. He knew what a natural omega heat was, the long cycle that ran for days and could not be rushed, and he knew this was not that. This was shorter and sharper, engineered, a surge the clinic built in as the fail-safe for exactly this, a unit that had not bonded on delivery. When the imprint did not take on its own, the body was made to force the question, one feverish night designed to overwhelm the will and make refusal impossible because the need would be too great to think through. It was a feature. It was the cruelest feature of all, because it meant that the man's own body would now try to finish what his will had refused. The fever took him fast. By midnight, Akira was burning, curled on the cot in the borrowed coat, and his scent filled the glass office and pressed against Itsuki's control like a hand against a door. The engineered notes screaming the message they had been built to scream, safe and yours and now, and under them the wild, scorched sugar smell of a man coming apart, the two scents at war in one body. "You can stop it," Akira said. His voice had lost its trained evenness entirely. He was shaking. "This is the part where it stops. If you do it now, I won't be able to mind. I won't be able to argue. It will be easy." He looked up at Itsuki with fever-bright eyes, and the most terrible thing was that he was offering it as a kindness, offering Itsuki the easy version, the one where the bond sealed during the heat and the settling smoothed everything over, and neither of them had to choose anything. Everyone would say it was right. It is what I'm for. Do it now while I can't stop you, and then it will be done, and I'll be well, and I'll love you, and neither of us will ever have to know if it was real. Itsuki knelt by the cot. The need in the air was enormous, a biological imperative that 2 years of grief and a lifetime of discipline barely held against, and his own body answered it. The alpha in him, straining toward the omega in heat, exactly as the brochure had promised, exactly as the clinic had engineered. It would have been so easy. It was designed to be easy. That was the whole horror of it. He took Akira's hand instead. He held it. He did not bite. He stayed. "No," Itsuki said. "Why?" Akira was crying now, and it was not only the fever. "Why? When it would fix me? Because you told me what settled means." Itsuki's voice was rough and low and certain. "You told me it means the part of you that minds the rice goes quiet. I'm not going to take advantage of a fever to put that part of you to sleep. If you ever bond to me, you're going to do it knowing exactly what you're doing, with all the parts of you awake and arguing, or you aren't going to do it at all. I would rather lose you whole than keep you smoothed over. So no, I'm not going to fix you. I'm going to sit here and hold your hand while your body lies to you. And in the morning, you're going to still be the man who hates that gum." Akira wept and clung to his hand, and the fever burned, and the scent raged, and Itsuki Mori sat on the cold floor of his own warehouse and refused, hour after hour, to take the thing that was being offered, to take the thing he had paid for, to take the easy bond and the smoothed man, and the rest he had wanted so badly that he had been willing to buy a person to get it. He held the hand, and he stayed, and he did not look away, and somewhere in the worst of the dark, the fever crested and broke, the way fevers do, and the engineered need ebbed out of the air, and what was left on the cot was a man, exhausted and soaked and shaking and entirely himself, who had been through the thing that was supposed to end his refusal and had come out the other side still refusing. The bond had not sealed. The fever had not won, and Akira, when he could finally speak, looked at Itsuki with an expression that the maid face had never worn before, because no one had ever earned it. "You stayed," he said. "Yes, you wanted to. I felt you want to, and you stayed anyway." "Yes." Akira closed his eyes. A breath went out of him, long and shuddering, showing white in the cold. "That's the first time," he said, "that anyone ever wanted my yes more than my obedience." Itsuki could not speak. He sat in the cold with the man's hand in his and understood that he had just been changed in some permanent way, that the cowardice that had walked him into signing those papers was gone, burned off in a fever that was never his, and that he would dismantle the entire world before he let anyone smooth this man over. But the refusal had a cost, and the cost came due fast. The someone never came. Maybe they were still deciding whether a single unit was worth the trip. Maybe the cold office and the false front company had bought them the days the message had threatened to take. Itsuki stopped watching the door after the second night and started watching Akira instead, because the thing that was going to kill him was not coming through the door. It was already inside him, and it was winning. Without the bond, the unsettling accelerated. Itsuki could smell it, the scorched sugar sharpening to something acrid, the iron note thickening, the man's scent beginning to come apart at the edges, and Akira grew weaker by the day, his attention dimming, the wonder he gave the trains and the cold and the egg sandwiches going faint. He was dying of the right to refuse. He was dying of being a person, and Itsuki, who had spent his whole life finding the single point where a closed system spoils, sat in the cold and took the thing apart in his head the way he took apart a failing root. The guide had said the cure was the bond, and he had believed the guide was lying, because people who sell things lie. But sitting with it, he understood the guide had not lied. It had only told him the part that sold. The bond did halt the degradation. That was true. What the guide had folded under, what it had been built to keep him from asking, was what the bond cost, and why. The degradation was not the absence of a bite. He was certain of that now. It was a contradiction the body could not hold. The imprint said belonged to him, the self, the part that minded the rice and hated the gum and wondered if it had a whole life, said, "I will not belong to anyone I did not choose." Two things on top, both demanding to be the truth, and the body coming apart trying to carry both at once. The bond did not heal that. It ended it. It forced one of the two down and held it there, and the one it forced up was always the imprint, and the one it buried was always the self, and the unit lived, smoothed over, the gift the buyer had paid for. But the guide had described only one way of doing it, because the people who wrote the guide had only ever done it one way. They sealed the bond during the surge. The engineered fever, when the need was screaming, and the will was gone, and the imprint was the loudest thing in the body. Of course the imprint won. You bit a man while he was drowning, and the drowning was what you saved. They had never once tried it any other way, because they had never once wanted the other thing to be what survived. They had built the whole machine to bury exactly the part of Akira that Itsuki had fallen in love with. He understood, sitting there, that the machine had a second door, and that no one had ever walked through it, because no one selling had ever wanted to. The contradiction collapsed when the bond sealed. Fine, but which half got buried depended on which half was on top when the claim landed. Seal it during the fever, and the imprint was on top, and the self went under. But wait. Wait until the fever broke, until Akira was awake, all of him, the part that argued sitting up on top and choosing. Do not take him while he was drowning. Let him surface. And then let him ask. If the claim landed while the self was the loudest thing in the body, while the self was the thing reaching for it, then the self was what the bond would save. The contradiction would still collapse. It would just collapse the right way. Not because he had been made to belong, but because, awake, he had decided to. He could not prove it and could not test it, and would only know by doing. Every instinct he had built across years of never looking away told him not to gamble a life on a thing he had reasoned out in the dark. But he had also spent 2 years certain that love was a thing done to you on a wet road, a thing you could only lose, and the man dying on the cot had taught him in a week that it could be a thing chosen instead, and he found that he believed his own reasoning the way he believed the cold chain, completely, because it was the only map he had, and because the alternative was to let the world bury the one person who had made him want to be in it. He went to the cot. Akira was awake, the fever long broken, the dimmed attention gathering itself back into something sharp at the look on Itsuki's face, because he had lived beside this man long enough to know when he had found the point where a system could be made to do the thing it was never built for. "It's your choice," Itsuki said, and his voice broke on the second word, the only crack in him all night, the rare and total fracture of a man who had relearned how to want something he could lose. "That's the entire point. It was always the entire point. The fever is gone. You are awake. I'm not going to take you while you can't stop me, the way they built it to happen. If you want to live, you have to ask for it, and you have to mean it, with every part of you on top and arguing, or it doesn't count, and I won't do it. So choose. Choose to leave, and I'll hold the door. Choose to stay, and then you tell me, and I'll." He knelt by the cot and did not reach for him. That was the hard part, the part that went against every instinct the designation had given him, the alpha built to claim holding still, with the claim right there in front of him, waiting to be invited instead of taking. He kept his hands at his sides, and he waited, with all the helpless terror of a man who had bought a thing that could not leave precisely, so that he would never have to feel this, and felt it anyway, completely, gladly. Akira looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, with the last of a strength that was visibly leaving him, he reached up and drew the collar of the borrowed coat away from his own throat, bearing the scent gland there, the Omega's throat, the place the claim was always meant to land, and he did it himself, with his own shaking hand, while he was awake enough to know exactly what he was offering. Akira held the coat away from his own throat. He was crying again, but it was not fever now. "If I do this," he said, "and I'm wrong, and the choosing was just another thing they built into me, then I'm choosing to belong to the man who bought me, and that's the worst thing I can imagine, and I'll have done it to myself." "Yes," Itsuki said, "and you won't tell me it's going to be all right. You won't make it easy. No, I'm going to make you do it knowing exactly what it costs. That is the only way it's yours." Akira closed his eyes. The scent in the office churned, the engineered notes and the wild ones, the made thing and the alive thing, the whole war of him rising. And then, slowly, with the last of a strength that was visibly leaving him, he kept his throat bared with one shaking hand and looked up at the man he was asking, and he said, in a voice that had nothing trained in it at all, that was entirely and only his own, "I don't know if this feeling is mine. I'll never know, but I want to find out by living. I don't want to be sure of it by dying, and no one made me think that. I thought it myself, in the cold, watching my own breath. So this is mine. Whatever else it is, this part is mine." His hand tightened on the collar, holding his throat bare. "Claim me. I'm asking, awake, and arguing, and certain of nothing except that I'm the one asking," and the alpha claimed him. Itsuki felt the bond catch, and it did not feel like a leash, and it did not feel like a product, and it did not feel like anything the brochure had promised, because the brochure had been written by people who had only ever done this to someone drowning. It felt like the moment in the cold chain when a shipment you were sure had spoiled turns out, against everything, to have held. The two scents met, and did not war, and did not blend, but became the third thing, the collision smell, the hot pan, and the cold water, except that this time it did not vanish when they parted, because they did not part, because it had a permanent place to live now, in a bond a made man had asked for with his own awake and arguing self. The degradation stopped. Itsuki felt it stop, felt the scorched iron edge ebb out of the air, and the man in his arms steady and strengthen, and he held Akira while the danger drained away, and their breath showed white in the cold air, and there was no one to see it, and nothing to say, only the two of them on the floor of a cold room, and a thing that had been certain to happen failing to happen, because a made man had asked to live awake, and the asking had held. What Itsuki did next, he did because he was a man who moved cold things across a country and knew that a threat you do not answer comes back. He did not give a speech to anyone. He was an alpha with a logistics company, not a crusader, and storming a corporate tower to lecture men more powerful than him about the sanctity of the soul would have been a satisfying lie. So he did what was actually in his power, the one thing his particular strength could do. He found out who owned the faceless company that had sold him a person, and it turned out to be a holding company with a cold chain distribution arm that Mori Logistics had been quietly outcompeting for years. And Itsuki, who knew exactly where every system spoiled, spent the following months doing what he was genuinely good at, until the holding company needed him more than he needed it, and the price of his cooperation was that the part of it that made people was closed, quietly, the way such things are always closed, with paperwork and a press release about strategic priorities, and no one ever saying the real word for what had been shut down. No one came for Akira again. There was no longer anyone whose business it was to. A year is a long time in some lives, and no time at all in others. For Itsuki Mori, it was both. The apartment was not clean and empty anymore. It smelled of things now, of cold canned coffee, and the gum Akira had decided he hated and bought anyway just to make the face, of warm water and rice, and the third smell that lived in the bond and did not vanish. The second bedroom had become a study because no one slept in it. There were trains visible from the window, and a man who still, after all this time, stopped to watch them stop and go, and reported on them, because he had decided that paying attention to ordinary things was a preference of his, one of the truest ones, and he was never going to give it up. Akira had a surname now. He had chosen it himself, after a long deliberation that he treated with enormous seriousness, trying several on and discarding them, because a name was a thing you should choose awake. He had not taken Mori. Itsuki had offered, and Akira had thought about it and said no, gently, that he would rather have a name that was only his to begin with, and then decide separately whether to share it, because the choosing had to come first, or it did not count. And Itsuki had understood completely, because by then, he understood everything about why the choosing had to come first. They were on the warehouse floor, of all places, on a cold night, because Akira liked the cold now, liked watching his own breath show white and disappear, liked the proof that he had weather inside him. He had come to bring Itsuki dinner because Itsuki worked too late, and Akira had developed strong opinions about this. He stood in the white clouds of his own breathing in a coat that fit him now, and he watched the man he had chosen approve a route on the Eastern Line, and he said, conversational, in the voice he used for the truest things, "I still don't know if the feeling is mine." Itsuki looked up from the route. "I think I never will," Akira went on. "I think I'll wonder, a little, every day, for the rest of my life, whether I love you because I decided to, or because they built me to point at you, and I just decided to call it deciding." He breathed out, white and slow. "For a long time that frightened me. I thought I needed to know. I thought if I couldn't be certain it was real, then it wasn't worth having. And now?" Akira smiled, the small, astonished smile he had worn the first night over a bowl of rice, when he discovered he could mind the temperature of a thing, that he had an inside that responded to the outside, that he was, against all design, a person to whom things happened. "Now I think that nobody knows," he said. "I think you don't know why you love me either. I think no one who has ever loved anyone has known whether it was the soul or the body or the blood or the wet road or the thing their mother called through a closed door when they were small. I think everyone is a little bit built, by everything that ever happened to them, to point where they point. The only difference is that I know who built me, and you don't." He shrugged inside the warm coat. "So I stopped needing to be certain. I just keep choosing it. Every morning, I wake up and I don't know if it's mine, and I choose it anyway, and the choosing is the part that's mine, and that turns out to be enough. It turns out to be the whole thing." The forklifts moved frozen cargo through the dark below them, every shipment at the exact right temperature, nothing spoiling, 1,000 points of possible failure all holding. Itsuki Mori set down the root and stood and went to the man who had asked to be claimed in the cold and chosen to live. And the third smell rose between them, sharp and clean and permanent, and did not vanish, because they did not part. Good, Itsuki said into the white cloud of their breathing. Then keep choosing it. I intend to. You should know I'm very stubborn. It may be the most real thing about me. I know, Itsuki said. I bought it on purpose. And Akira laughed, the scandalized, delighted laugh he had discovered he had, the one that was his and only his, white in the cold air, and a man who had once paid a fortune so that he would never have to love something free had lost that bet completely and counted it the best money he had ever spent. The end. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the story, tell me your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you.